Irrespective of whether you are working with one individual, a group of individuals, or a team, one of the key competencies that you must master is how to motivate your people. Think of someone you work with who you might describe as unmotivated. Do you know why they're not motivated? If your answer was, I don't know, or because they're lazy, you need to dig deeper. Everyone has the capacity to be motivated. We just need to find the trigger and leverage it. To begin to understand how to better motivate your people, it is useful to have a solid understanding of how motivation works. Fortunately, there is a wealth of good information about what motivates people. In fact, there is way too much research and theory on motivation to cover in 1 week, so we will focus on a few of the most useful motivation theories. First, by way of definition, Mitchell defines motivation as those psychological processes that cause the arousal, direction, and persistence of voluntary actions that are goal-directed. So, motivation triggers arousal or interest. It determines the direction of that interest and how persistent you are. It targets voluntary, goal-directed actions, meaning that people make a conscious choice about which goals or objectives to pursue, and that motivation directs behavior toward trying to achieve those particular goals. But how do you do this? How do you influence someone's arousal, direction, and persistence? And how do you shape their goals? First, let's focus on the goals themselves. How can we help shape an individual's choice about which goals they pursue? Just as high-performing teams need clarity surrounding their shared objectives, individuals need that clarity surrounding their individual goals and objectives. Let's start by looking at Locke and Latham's goal-setting theory, one of the most widely researched and widely supported theories in organizational science. We know goals work, and we have a strong understanding of how and when they work best. Goal-setting theory tells us that in order for goals to direct our behavior, we must first know how to accomplish the goal, and second, we must accept that goal and be willing to work for it. These two aspects are key. First, knowing how to accomplish the goal requires clarity surrounding the objective. A practical mnemonic for setting clear goals is to make them SMART: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. For example, you might have a goal to improve your leadership practice. Fantastic! That's a great goal to have, but it isn't very smart. Let's take this example of improving leadership practice and try to apply these principles. Specific. What does improving leadership look like? Rather than focusing on this generic idea of leadership, we might start by breaking it down into specific behaviors or outcomes. Hackman says team member satisfaction is one of the outcomes of an effective team. So let's use this. Rather than improving leadership more broadly, we can focus on the specific goal of improving team member satisfaction. Measurable. Although imperfect, we can measure team satisfaction with a 10-point satisfaction survey rating. However, if our goal is not measurable or uses a flawed measure, it won't be as motivating. Attainable. It is not motivating to say, achieve a perfect satisfaction rating, because this is extremely difficult. We want challenging goals, but not to the point where they are almost unattainable. Self-efficacy theory says that we must believe we have the ability to successfully perform a targeted behavior. Otherwise, we are not motivated, even in the face of fantastic rewards. So in our example, maybe we attempt to increase team satisfaction ratings by 1 point on the rating scale. Relevant. Is the goal relevant to the task objective? In this example, does team satisfaction actually reflect leadership aptitude? Maybe. If we think our goal does not really capture how effective leadership is, we might want to reconsider the goal. Time-bound. What is the timeline for improvement? It is good to set the target close enough to be on the radar, but far enough away so it is achievable and so we have time to learn and improve. In addition to having SMART goals, ongoing feedback is useful for recognizing if we are on track to meet those goals, guiding our level of effort and providing an opportunity to learn. In our example, if we are trying to improve our team satisfaction ratings, it would be useful to check in with our team members to get feedback on how they were feeling about the team dynamic, and what you might do differently as a leader to improve that dynamic. The second key aspect of goal-setting theory is an individual's willingness to accept and work toward the goal. Why are people willing to strive for that particular goal? The trick to this is linking outcomes to goal achievement, the incentive. At a very basic level, this means that a behavior is strengthened or weakened by the consequences associated with it. If a particular behavior is tied to a desired outcome or avoidance of an undesired outcome, people are willing to work for it. The classic theories of behaviorism and reinforcement support this notion, including the work of Pavlov, Thorndike, Watson, and Skinner. In this classic view, behavior is like a reflex, and people can be shaped to any job or role simply by changing the incentives. In the words of John Watson, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggarman and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and the race of his ancestors." Even then, this was a bit of an extreme view. Total nurture over nature. Since then, we have established that the strength of the link between behavior and outcome is determined by both nature and nurture, and that people exert conscious, self-regulatory control over their goal pursuit. The idea of using incentives, rewards, and punishments for motivating employees seems simple enough to implement, but there are a few traps that organizations fall into. As alluded to when discussing goal-setting theory, it can be challenging to measure performance success. Perhaps this is not a problem if you have a job in sales or manufacturing where you can count inputs and outputs, but most modern jobs have outcomes that depend on coordination among a group of people. It is often hard to identify who is responsible for success and failure, and the specific value that their work contributes to that outcome. In addition, it can be hard to identify the specific behaviors that you want to incentivize. Take, for example, a sales job where there's often a system of commission. Sales commission really does impact performance. However, if this is the only thing being incentivized, there may be unintended consequences. Employees may not act as a team because they are competing for a sale. The focus may be on the sale, not customer satisfaction, so employees may stretch the truth about the value of the product or fairness of the price being offered. There may also be disagreements between employees about who has to work with the slow sales shifts. Targeting specific goals and incentivizing them can come at the cost of other, less explicit goals that are critical to overall team success. This gets worse if your incentives are not aligned with the organization, purpose, and strategy. Kerr points out that there are a lot of cases where organizational goals and incentives are not aligned with its purpose. A classic example is the case of orphanages. One of the key goals of an orphanage is to find homes for orphaned children. However, in many countries, orphanages are given government funding based on the number of children in their care. The goal of finding homes for children is undermined by the incentive to keep sufficient numbers of orphans to effectively run the business. It is also well established that the incentives or outcomes are not necessarily all about money. Yes, money is really important. I'm not going to work unless I'm getting a paycheck. But that paycheck and the size of that paycheck doesn't necessarily make me work any harder. But don't tell my boss that. During the Industrial Revolution, humans were literally considered resources. Scientific management in those days focused exclusively on reinforcement, basic carrot and stick management. This form of employee behavior control worked very efficiently in the factories, particularly in the absence of safety standards and worker rights. But as the nature of work has shifted away from the factory to more knowledge-based work, so too has our view of incentives. The classic narrative comes from a series of studies that took place in the 20s and 30s in the suburbs of Chicago, at the Western Electric's factory at Hawthorne. The purpose of the studies was to understand the effect of physical working conditions on factory productivity. As the story goes, the researchers first identified a group of workers who would serve as the test subjects. This group was given improved lighting conditions. The researchers observed factory productivity and found that the group with the improved lighting increased their productivity. But then they tried a group with worse lighting. Oddly, that group also produced higher productivity. They changed working conditions in a variety of ways, like shifting work hours and changing the rest break schedule. Every time they made a change, productivity seemed to increase. By the time the series of studies was complete, factory productivity was at an all-time high, and absenteeism was at a record low. Elton Mayo and his colleagues, the researchers conducting the Hawthorne studies, concluded that it was not any particular set of working conditions that increased productivity. Instead, productivity went up whenever the researchers showed interest and started asking employees their opinions about the work conditions. The added employee motivation followed from showing interest in them and the apparent value of their work. Since then, we've learned that the basic subsistence needs that money provides is only part of what motivates us. We are also motivated by our natural drive for things like achievement, belongingness, esteem, control, and meaning. There are a number of needs-based theories that talk about a variety of fundamental needs that drive motivation, both physiological and psychological. Hertzberg's motivator hygiene theory illustrates this idea very well. His framework says that there are hygiene factors that incentivize us to meet standards, to do just enough work so that we don't get into trouble. Money is one of those hygiene factors. However, there are also motivators that incentivize us to go above and beyond, to aspire for greater levels of achievement, working towards voluntary goals. Dissatisfaction stems from a lack of hygiene factors, while satisfaction follows from fulfillment of motivator factors. Self-determination theory makes a similar distinction between motivation that follows from extrinsic versus intrinsic rewards. Extrinsic rewards are external to the individual employee, usually controlled by management. Intrinsic rewards are internal to the individual employee. Things like opportunities for personal growth or achievement, a sense of choice and autonomy in the work being conducted, feelings of appreciation and value from the organization, the belief that the work being done has a higher meaning or purpose, or even enjoyment and pleasure in doing the work. The intrinsic motivators are what take performance to the next level. The more a job satisfies these intrinsic needs, the more internalized the work goals become, and the more willing employees will be in regulating their own efforts to achieve those goals, rather than having to be monitored or controlled. So what does this mean for motivating our followers? On the one hand, it means that different individuals may be predisposed to different needs. For some, their efforts will be primarily about money, but for others, it is also about recognition and appreciation, or the opportunity to work with coworkers that they like, or feelings of ownership and accomplishment in their work, or the belief that their work products have meaning and purpose, or even having fun. Importantly, if you know your individual followers and recognize what motivates them, you can adapt the work process to fit their needs. For example, if you have an employee who you know has a high need for achievement, they will be particularly motivated by challenging goals and any useful feedback you can give them. However, the fact that employees have a variety of intrinsic motives also means that you can design the work itself so that it is inherently more motivating. Hackman and Oldham's job characteristics theory says that there are specific conditions that can leverage intrinsic needs and motivate employees. Specifically, they talk about the importance of skill variety, the range of novel tasks inherent to the job, task identity, the sense of ownership and identity with the outcomes they produce, task significance, the positive impact of the job on others or on broader society, autonomy, the freedom and independence inherent to a particular job or role, and feedback, task clarity, and the ability to gauge the effectiveness of individual efforts. Clearly, there is a lot of information, theories, and frameworks about motivation, and we're only just scratching the surface. Let's summarize the key takeaways we have covered. First, setting goals can be effective in motivating employees. However, goals must be smart so that workers know how to accomplish the goal, and they must be linked to valuable outcomes. Second, the carrot and stick approach works very well, but will only get you so far. It can be hard to measure specific behaviors to incentivize. And even if you are able to measure behavior, the enhanced motivation may come at the cost of other organizational objectives that are not being rewarded. Third, beyond money, recognize the broader range of intrinsic rewards that can be used to motivate behavior. It is these intrinsic motives that really take performance to the next level. 4. Adapt the work to leverage intrinsic motivation. This can be done through thoughtful and effective work design and by applying individual consideration to the needs and interests of individual employees. Together, these ideas can help you to diagnose motivation problems in your work teams and groups. Consider the source of the problem, or better yet, ask. Then consider what you can do to address the source of that motivational problem. It is also worth noting the critical role of managers and leaders in employee motivation. Managers provide the clarity. They help direct workers to achieve organizational objectives, to set goals, to give feedback, and to track execution. So managers are very often a key source of motivation for employees. They are on the front lines and can really make or break motivation in a work group. Leaders, on the other hand, provide a higher level meaning and purpose, the intrinsic value of work that takes individual motivation to the next level. Take, for example, companies like Apple, Google, and SpaceX. They have a reputation for highly motivated and hardworking employees, in part because the visionary leadership of these organizations have inspired workers to see themselves as part of a larger purpose and as having direct impact into achieving that vision. So both management and leadership competencies are important for motivating your people and to get the most out of your team.